Welcome to part one of Contract Law, the first installment in a two-part series. Contract law is really at the heart of law and citizen. Contracts are all about the agreements we make with one another, and go back to such fundamental things as the social contract that created government that makes and enforces our society's laws. So let's start with the basics of a contract. A contract is, in the first place, an agreement. It's particularly an agreement that involves an exchange. In the case of our social contract, it was the exchange of freedom on the part of citizens in exchange for protection of rights and enforcement of laws by government. As you might have guessed from the previous statement, there must be two or more parties, right? Or in this specifically, two or more persons involved in a contract. And finally, a contract is legally binding. Right? So it's an agreement, it's an exchange between two or more parties that can be enforced in court if one side does not live up to their end of the deal. In terms of the elements that actually go into a contract, first, for an agreement or an exchange, we must have a specific offer. I agree to give you this in exchange for that. There has to be acceptance of the offer by both sides. And there's something involved here called consideration. Consideration are things of value, right, that both sides exchange. In the case of our social contract story, again, citizens gave up freedom, something valuable. In exchange, the government provided the services of protection of rights, enforcement of laws, and of course today governments also provide many additional services such as the education in which you are currently participating. And in more day-to-day, less abstract contracts, we see in the example of this image, right, an exchange of consideration, something valuable, in this case a car, for money. Right? So clearly an exchange of two valuable things. And the final element is competence. You cannot enter into a contract unless both parties are competent, meaning they have the wherewithal to understand the terms of the contract and live up to it. So you can't be impaired by drugs, alcohol, other conditions, or mentally ill. In those cases, any contract you enter into will be invalid. And people who are mentally ill are often adjudicated legally incompetent to enter into contracts and are assigned guardians who can enter into those contracts on their behalf. All right. And I don't want to imply in any of this that children are incompetent, and I know some of you don't like being called kids, but until you're 18, in the eyes of the law, you are still a kid. And so we need to understand how contracts are in effect or not in effect for people under the age of 18. And so, of course, we are talking about what are known as minors, anyone who is under the age of 18. For this age group, contracts are mostly unenforceable because you're not deemed to have the experience or the knowledge to enter into a lot of contracts. And contracts can be very complicated, even for people who are well in excess of 18 years old. Right. The exception to enforceability is things that you need. Right? If you enter into a contract for shelter, that's deemed something that you can understand the need and the value of. And if you enter into such a contract, you're probably going to be held accountable for it. It could also be for food. It's something that's clearly a necessity. Everybody understands that from a pretty early age. And so if, let's say, that you order a pizza to be delivered and it shows up, you're not going to be able to just renege on that contract because you are under 18. You're going to be expected to pay for that food. As a consequence, though, of the fact that most contracts are unenforceable for people under the age of 18, if you want to enter into a contract, you are going to need a cosigner, right, as seen in this image, right? An adult, somebody of majority age, over the age of 18, who will make a promise, right? They're guaranteeing the loan or whatever the contract is on your behalf, right? And what they're promising is they will take responsibility if you don't live up to your end of the deal. Now, that only lasts until you are 18. Any contract that a minor has entered into, if after 18 they have held up to the contract, they've maybe continued to make payments or some other aspect of fulfilling their obligation, then they become fully responsible for that contract. Right? It's considered that by their behavior they have formally approved or ratified that contract. It's important to understand in our discussion of contracts that there are two types, oral contracts and written contracts, and the two certainly are not equal. Let's start with oral contracts. These are just contracts that are spoken, maybe a handshake contract. These can be okay for small amounts. If we're talking about exchanges that are in the realm of less than $500. Even there, we'll see that there are some limitations. That written contracts are required in the following circumstances. Exchanges that involve more than $500. If you are loaning someone money, even if it's less than $500, you must have a written contract. If you are making a real estate or rental agreement, so you're buying property, leasing property, that all requires a contract. Those of you who get out on your own and start out in an apartment, you will sign rental agreements. That is a contract. That has to be written, even if it's a month-to-month contract and your rent is less than $500. You also need written contracts for any obligation that is going to be spanned out over longer than a year. An example of that, a clear example of that, is an employment contract. Now, you might not work for that company or that business or that person for more than a year, but there's kind of the understanding that there's a long-term relationship, and in that case, you will need a contract that specifies both sides' obligations. And, another example here before we move on, if you sign a phone plan that involves you paying for a new phone as you go, and it's a 2-year contract, well, there you have it right there. It's a contract. You're going to have to sign that. It's going to be in writing. Now, as I said, oral versus written contracts, they are not equal. Written contracts are stronger in court, stronger in the law, and it will take precedence. So any verbal agreement you make, any oral agreement you make, is going to be superseded by a written agreement. And especially this final point is important here. Courts rarely consider any oral agreement that comes before a written contract. So it doesn't matter what you might have agreed when you're talking with somebody about a deal. What's actually on paper that both parties have signed is what will count. And this is part of the reason for including this image here. In an oral contract, it's much more difficult to enforce. Right? Somebody might not be sincere, and in court, you may have difficulty proving that the party represented here by the gentleman crossing his fingers behind his back really said what he said, right? Because he might come back with a different story. So it's important to have contracts in writing. Even if you know a person, even if you have every expectation things will go well, getting contracts in writing is very important for your own protection. All right. Move on to the subject of illegal contracts. This may seem kind of a strange thing, but it helps us understand some aspects of our society. And one of the main points here is that any contract involving an illegal exchange is not enforceable. Examples of these: murder for hire. Right? If somebody wants to hire someone to kill their spouse, right, we might call it a contract kill, but there's no way to enforce that contract. If the paid assassin fails to kill your spouse, you cannot take them to court for failing to live up to the obligation. It'd be kind of hilarious if you tried, but it's not enforceable. The same with prostitution. Those involve the same elements of a contract, but not enforceable except where prostitution is legal. And drug deals. If you are involved in a drug deal, you are also entering into a contract of sorts, but it's not enforceable. Right? If somebody doesn't give you as much drugs as they were supposed to for the money, you have no legal remedy. Right? It's partly why we see violence in the drug trade and violence in prostitution, because contracts are not enforceable by legal means. Another aspect of non-enforceable illegal contracts are contracts based on fraud. Some examples of this: counterfeit goods, as we see in the Adidas hoodie on the right-hand side of the screen. If someone sells you a good that has been counterfeited, maybe they have faked some kind of antique or memorabilia, maybe a signed copy of a book or a baseball, they can't enforce that contract if the goods are themselves fraudulent. And also false statements. If someone sold this to you as a chopper motorcycle, that would be clearly a false statement. There is no motive power except for whatever you can put to it through the pedals. However, information that is withheld is not the same as a false statement, right? And it's not the same as fraud. Somebody who's selling you a car that runs good, right, might be withholding quite a bit of information about that car. Sure, it might be the case that it runs good, which should be a warning sign to you anyway, right? Anybody who doesn't know that it's run well, you may want to have some doubts. But runs good doesn't mean that this wasn't a car that was caught in a flood down in Texas in 2017 and has all kinds of water damage throughout. Withheld information, again, is not necessarily fraud, which means you need to be very careful. You must examine what you're going to buy, and you must ask lots of questions. If you ask questions and receive dishonest answers, then you might have more grounds for claiming fraud at a later date. So always be careful. People are not responsible for being forthcoming with you, but you can hold them responsible for being honest if they make false statements to you, especially if you can prove that they knew they were making false statements. And that concludes part one of our look at contract law. All right, stay tuned for the next installment on this, where we will look at breach of contract and other means of having contracts dissolved. See you in class.